you know, this is a Wisdom School alert for you. Over at wisdomschool.com, I published a piece about learned resilience and how that's the key to a good life. I first became aware of this back in the 1980s when I read a study that came out of Kauai, Hawaii. It was started in 1955. It lasted about 20 years. It was a longitudinal study. They followed young people who were born in 1955, or they were children in 1955, born to sugarcane workers on this isolated Hawaiian island. Now, Kauai is a fairly prosperous island now, but in 1955, it was nothing but sugar plantations and shacks for the workers to live in. Widespread poverty, massive levels of child abuse and neglect. And so these children were kind of the bottom of the barrel kids in America at the time. And so these sociologists went in and just tracked them for 20, 30 years. And, you know, how did they grow up? Now, with normal kids in a normal childhood, there is a bell curve distribution of fragility, emotional fragility, and resilience, emotional resilience. And, you know, the bell curve is fairly broad. There's a small number of people who are very fragile, a small number of people who are very resilient, and most people are kind of in between. They've got a little bit of fragility and a little bit of resilience, but, you know, they're kind of in between. Well, what they found with the children from Kauai, these children who had suffered privation and extreme poverty and child abuse, was that predictably more of them were fragile. The middle of the bell curve had become compressed, so there were more fragile ones over on the left side of the bell curve, but there were also more resilient ones on the right side of the bell curve, which was interesting. Geez, abuse can create resilience? Which raised the second question, what is the difference between the two? What is it that causes children who are exposed to the exact same circumstance, the exact same stressors, the exact same poverty, the exact same abuse, to become more fragile or more resilient? And it turned out there were 4 factors, and they really did their work on this. The first was temperament. In other words, you're born to a certain extent with resilience or fragility. The second was what researchers called protective factors in the family. In other words, there was a member of the family who was protecting these children, or at least providing them with some emotional support. The third was protective factors in the community, teachers, pastors, mentors, coaches, who offered positive reinforcement. But perhaps the most important was the stories they told themselves about what was happening to them. Those children who told themselves that they were responsible for the abuse that was visited upon them by adults and others in their community, those children became fragile. And the children who told themselves the story that they were not responsible for the abuse, that the adults who were doing the abuse were responsible for it, they ended up more resilient, which, you know, just really emphasizes the importance of the stories we tell ourselves. There's an entire field of psychotherapy that has been built out of this. There's actually 2 of them, narrative psychology and cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, which all have to do with altering the stories we tell ourselves about what's happening to us and making those stories less toxic, less destructive, less likely to produce fragility, and more resilient. Making those stories, you know, stories of conquest, of success, even in times of great adversity. You know, there's the old saying, you know, we can't control what happens to us, but we can always control how we respond to it. And there's more than a grain of truth to that. And this study really, really illustrates this. If you want to see all the details, just go to wisdomschool.com. It's right up at the top of the page. I think you'll find it fascinating. It's 18 minutes past the hour. I'll be back with your calls on the other side of this break. It's Talk Media for the Sane Among Us, the Thom Hartmann Program. We'll be right back. Stay tuned.